So this is the roundtable for our discussion of Edward Tylor, the anniversary of his death, 100 years commemoration, and with me, and including myself, we have contributors to this book, Edward Tylor, Religion and Culture. Paul, I'm afraid you had a suggestion for what we should do first.
I did. My suggestion as a sort of point of departure was thinking about this Tylor project as part of a wider question about our relationship to classical theory. And I just thought that might be a nice place to begin. What do we do with early scholarship in anthropology of religions, sociology, religious studies, etc., and what's our relationship to it?
Okay, so would you like to show us how that's done? Tell us.
Well, I don't think it's a question of showing you how it's done. But for me, anyway, being involved in this project made me read Tylor in a different way. I'd been used to a particular kinds of accounts of Tylor's work in secondary literature. I'd been used to allowing those works to direct me to primitive culture and a couple of other things that Tylor wrote, and you know, my Tylor, as it were, was framed by that secondary literature. This project, I read Primitive Culture, 2 volumes, and a couple of other books, the book Anthropology, a few articles, and I started to get a sense of that there were other Tylors apart from the sort of canonical account. And I found it a really refreshing process. At the same time as doing that, I was actually involved in a slightly different project, which meant that I was also reading The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life by EB Durkheim. And I was reading that also from, you know, from cover to cover, and a few other things by Durkheim. And I started to get a very different picture of the kinds of conversations taking place between scholars at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And yeah, it changed my relationship with that theory. And I think I got a hell of a lot out of it, frankly. And I thoroughly recommend it to others. Read that material. Yeah, of course, you need the secondary literature. It's there for a reason and it's helpful. But at the same time, you also need to defamiliarize yourself and engage with the texts as freshly as possible.
It was also interesting, as well as doing some of that, rereading, I wouldn't say I read both the volumes or the other work, but reading more of Tylor, but also reading other people's work as we were editing the book, and being pointed to other parts to look up and think, okay, so that enriches my understanding of what he was trying to do, and the data he was using, the way he used it. But also it's been interesting, a lot of the chapters in the book do this comparative thing, as Jim's does, and as mine does, other people's do, think about Tylor's practice and his argument alongside other people's, and see that. So that too was quite an interesting experience, seeing, you know, selective reading sometimes by other people, and seeing how our theories and our work arises out of these interesting conversations. So,
well, I mean, I came at this very much from quite a different stage in my career, because I looked at the relationship between modern theory and EB Tylor for my master's project. So this really came out of from my undergraduate exposure to theory and method, which was one of the elements I found the most interesting. But so I was quite fascinated with the bits of Tylor that had been presented, but it was very much in a, as Paul has touched on, in a very kind of codified, boxed in. But I thought there was a lot of explanatory potential there. So I wanted to sort of go back and pursue this at a deeper level with my master's. And I think it was when I actually really had to get to grips with the primary sources with the 2 volumes of Primitive Culture, that it really became apparent to me sort of really just how much can be lost without necessarily being wrong. You know, it's not, as I think we touch on in the book, it's not necessarily the case that the canonical Tylor, as we've called it, is an inaccurate depiction. It's just a limited one, and perhaps a necessarily limited one. But it's the fact that when you actually go and read the primary sources in context, it's quite a different experience. And sometimes the kind of voice, the nuances, and the humanity of some of the early scholars that we look at can really get lost. That they're actually far more persuasive, especially in their own context, than we often give them credit for. So as much as my particular focus has been Tylor, I hope that I've at least internalized these lessons, as in other key theorists that I'm only dimly aware of, or only aware of the canonical version of, that I might already begin to suspect that there's more to the picture that I'm missing, and at least try to look for that in future.
So Liam, you discovered Tylor during your undergraduate studies.
Yeah.
Which is to say that your lecturers put him on a reading list.
Yes, that's true.
And for that reason, I think it's kind of surprising that we are surprised that we get a lot out of reading Tylor, because we must have known this at some level. Well, I say I don't do this kind of work, but like the rest of you around this table presumably assign Tylor. So why do you do that?
No, I haven't.
Oh, really? Okay.
I assign him, but it's in the same manner that when I was in graduate school and seminars, it was little snippets. Nobody assigned a complete work of Tylor or Malinowski or Evans Pritchard or Fraser, or oftentimes they wind up in readers where, and this is what they meant, and that's what you get. So this is one of the fantastic things about not only being in the volume, it's also, as you mentioned, that going in and actually reading exactly what he said, which makes a world of difference.
But what motivates people who design syllabi to put the classical, even if snippets of the classical texts, what motivates people who construct these syllabi to put them in there in the first place? Is it for pure historical interest? Do scholars like yourselves think that there's something of value for today? How does it come about that these people appear in our textbooks? I ask this question because in the sciences this doesn't really happen, right? We don't. I mean, we don't assign Darwin's origin really anymore in biology classes, right? We don't really assign Freud in psychology classes.
The question would be, why not?
Yeah, well, indeed, right? But I mean, if the question is, what is it that we get out of it? I think the question is precisely as you said, why and why not? Like, what are the pros and cons of putting in or omitting the venerable texts of our intellectual traditions in our syllabi? I don't think it should be taken for granted that all the things that were written in the past should be jettisoned in a sort of, like Dan Dennett likes to say that he's never read any philosophy written, 60 years prior or something like that. But like, that's ridiculous, right? But just because those two positions are ridiculous doesn't mean that we don't need reasons for the middle position.
One of the answers to your question, I think, is in Liam's phrase, the canonical Tylor, that there are a number of canonical figures who are set as reading. So there has been, I don't know if people are still producing readers, maybe they are, I produced a couple, in which we select short extracts from people, from canonicals, very rarely saying, I think, that the issues that they engage with or the methods that they practiced are still current or should generate more work. So, well, some of them do that clearly, and I think we've demonstrated that very well. That Tylor and others do clearly have the potential to generate new questions, or to bring us back to the nub of what the question that we're asking now. So in my case, the kind of what does animism mean? In Jim's case, what does monotheism mean? How do they define it? How do the people putatively among whom we research, what do they think those terms mean?
Well, I think part of the approach has been, for example, in Eric Sharp's classic Comparative Religion and History, is to provide a kind of basis and understanding of what's gone before, so that the students don't think that we're just, inventing things as they come along, and here's a new idea, because many of the new ideas are old ideas, and they've been reworked and rethought through. And so I think that students need a background, but of course they also can make the mistake of, which we sometimes make, is just simply critiquing them in the light of 100 and some years later, and applying theories and methods that, ignoring everything that's come in between. But I do think it's important to study the classical and his important figures in the history. Another thing that I've done has been to use these figures, because my area of development has been the phenomenology of religion, and many of the key phenomenologists of religion, writing in the early to mid 20th century, bounced themselves off, particularly criticizing them for their assumptions about evolutionary ideas, about the development, the advancement, according to almost an application of Darwinian theory in social contexts. And part of the theory there was to say, well, unless we're aware of these presuppositions that influence the way we think, we won't be able to critique our own ways of thinking. So that's another. And then just one other thing, and that is, when I was most recently been doing the work in Australia, the practical effect of these writers. For example, the theories of Baldwin Spencer and his cohort Frank Gillen about the Aboriginal peoples of Australia being the lowest form of human development. And there's a very famous quote that I use, that just like the platypus has gone and faded away, so will these people inevitably be taken over by the more advanced civilizations. And if one thinks about the social consequences of this idea, it could be argued, and has been argued, that this way of thinking led to justification for genocide, because Aboriginal peoples are going to be made extinct anyway, naturally. So we can take over, and a lot of thinking could be said that these theories are not just in the air, just up in the air, but they actually have social consequences. So these are the three things I would say. They need a foundation. We need to be able to critique them according to other theories, and we need to know the social consequences of our thinking.
I mean, the way I encountered Tylor as a student, as an undergraduate, was in a class about definitions. So you had the substantive Tylorian definition, the functional Durkheimian definition, and the pinnacle at that point was, Clifford Geertz, and maybe we read Assad, Talal Assad alongside that if we had a particularly brave tutor.
Which you probably usually didn't, but that's it.
Yeah. So that's the kind of way in which Tylor would appear in undergraduate curricula. I was thinking of readers. The last anthropology of religion reader I recall is Michael Lambeck.
Blackwell.
Yeah, okay. And I think Tylor's in there,
Yes.
and I think it's around this definition of religion, belief in spiritual beings, as we all know, and that's part of the history of a conversation. Eric Sharp's is a good example. Brian Morris, anthropology.
Fiona Bowie.
Exactly. Yeah. And Tylor's in all of them, one way or another.
Yeah. But actually, that's exactly how I encountered it first. It was in a class talking about the definition of religion.
That's right.
And I because sometimes you're just given a select quote. And obviously students can't be interested in every quote that they're fed. But the thing is that sometimes you're only given, you're only given a little piece, and then you're not given the materials to read them on your own. You might not be given a chapter to read or anything like that. So in my case, though, it really, really sparked my curiosity, because I wanted to know a bit more about what this actually meant. And when we went on to explore theories, for example, in greater detail, I found that James Fraser, one of the texts we were using was Daniel Paul's 8 Theories of Religion. Yeah. And I think it's a very, very good introduction, actually, but it actually puts Tylor and Fraser together, because they do have similar theories in many respects, but actually quite different. So they just get a chapter in and of themselves, and he rushes through the material because he has to, quite at a pace. So the issue is that sometimes the nuances can really, really get lost.
They can, but undergraduates need to have this, they can be introduced to the primary sources. But if they don't have the foundation, you're not going to ask a first-year undergraduate student to read 2 volumes of primitive culture. It just wouldn't go. So, I mean, you have to give them a kind of basis, and then they can generate their interest and go further, and they might go to postgraduate work.
Well, there's seminars where I have colleagues that assign Pauls to get them. But it's because at the introductory level, they may be coming in from other disciplines.
That's right.
Absolutely.
So, Graham, as you mentioned, you have a reader, and this is where I was actually introduced to your work. So, like a stepping stone to many of these larger works, I think they certainly have their place. Within being third year into graduate school, I think certainly it's time to start reading some of the major heavyweights that we're talking about, and certainly including Tylor.
But that's interesting that we, even in the book, most of us engage with primitive cultures, and we go a bit from that, but you went somewhere very different. So I'm not even sure I knew that he'd written anything like before.
Well, indeed.
I knew he'd been to London to hang out with spiritualists and so on, but the whole idea of going to Cuba and then Mexico. So is that book used by anthropologists?
No, most of my colleagues, when I told them about this chapter that they were writing, they were like, "He did what? Tylor did what? Are you talking about that Tylor?" And I'm like, "Yes.
I know, it's all you hear." But it was not one, that book that was a reader, but we used it in first year course many years ago. But it had little introductions, and in the introduction it mentioned that Tylor went to Mexico, and that he wasn't just an armchair anthropologist. Tried to give the students an idea. No, he's noted for that and criticized for that, but he actually did do some field studies.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
The Pauls thing is interesting, I think, because I think one way of reading the Pauls book is, as opposed to an introduction to now 9, I believe, theorists of religion. Of course, the title is 9 theories of religion, right? So what Pauls does with these figures is as paradigmatic examples of ideas.
Yes.
And that seems like a perfectly reasonable way to think about what to do with these classical texts as just very good examples of maybe a terrible thing, but nevertheless very good examples of a thing.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not. I think you're both absolutely correct. There's only, because you're introducing students to these ideas, you can only package them in so many ways, and obviously you cannot cover everything to the same degree. And actually, I think what was interesting is that there's actually. Because I think Tylor seems to be one of these figures that people develop a periodic interest in, but that sometimes is not quite as sustained as figures such as Durkheim. And it's actually not even necessarily, there's not even necessarily always the scholarship to cover every kind of theorist that has had an input in the process. And no, I certainly agree that you have to package these ideas in one way or another, and you're always going to leave something out. So I don't mean that as a sort of critique of Pauls per se.
No. There does seem to be something different between the way that Durkheim and others in sociology are kind of these founding figures, much more positively quoted.
Yes.
Whereas Tylor, my impression is usually set up as, okay, that was fine in the 19th century, but we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was stuck in his armchair, and even if we know. He didn't do enough of it to allow us to make his
I want to mention Anne Calvig's chapter at this point, because Anne's chapter is all about the seances and Tylor's interest in spiritualism. And I think, don't tap the table, indeed. Well, if the chairs dance, what are we going to do? And I think, like Miguel's chapter, that it really contributes to, because I remember from as an undergraduate student that Tylor didn't do any fieldwork. Turns out he did actually quite a lot. The posthumously published fieldwork notes about the seance that were published by Stocking and that Anne Calvig works with. I thought they were really, really interesting. And there's a very ambivalent Tylor there about about what's taking place, that reveal quite a lot about his own, maybe his own relationships with mortality, with his class, with his background as a Quaker, with what he wants to, I think, perhaps believe about science and let's say superstition. But at the same time, being emotionally and intellectually challenged by being at these events.
Yes.
I think it's like in Mexico. Things happen in the seances that Calder writes about, and things happen when he's wandering around. I mean, not just whether he gets a taste for certain kinds of food, but these experiences that he has, that he obviously wants to be more celebratory, and then perhaps retreats into this more distant version for whatever reason. I mean, that's so yeah, it's a kind of interesting multiple Tylors that we discover, and maybe there wasn't one even for him, that he's a kind of conflicted figure, being attracted to things that he then wants to dismiss as superstition, or they must have been manipulating the table for this to happen. So yeah, very interesting character.
It's well, this is like coming back to what gets assigned and why. It's like these are he's obviously a genius. He's just, as most people that intellect, he's very complicated. It's very complicated. In Mexico, it'd be great to have a photograph of him in a serape, as he says he used to wear. I can just see him, in Mexican garb.
That would be good.
Absolutely.
I think there's a quest there in the archives to find such a picture.
So I think one of the things that happens, I think, in studies, and I think it's a symptom just of academia, is having a knee-jerk reaction to who these people were, and this is what I learned in a seminar, and Tylor was this or this other academic, however great they were in their time, and I want nothing to do with them. I'm going to argue it without ever actually reading their work.
Freud would have a field day with that.
Yes.
You're right.
I don't know about the sort of other classical thinkers, but certainly one good reason I think to read the Victorian theorists is that nobody writes like that anymore.
That's true.
Right? I mean, we talk. I don't want to give the audience the impression that the 2-volume dusty primitive cultures, 4 inches of book, is hard read, because it's not. A book, but it's a cracking read, and this is true for so many Victorian theorists. Don't know what happened, really. I don't know why we started writing terribly, but it isn't true of Tylor.
There's a wealth of examples that he brings together, and whether he does that in this strange kind of counter to curiosities thing sometimes, that there's not quite like Golden Bough, but something of that flavour. There's all these weird and wonderful things, and you think some of it, he's got this information, data that has been sent to him, and he's presenting it back to people to say, look, humans do amazing things.
Right.
What are we going to do with that? So yeah, that was very rich.
I'm going to be so bold as the person who's not an anthropologist to suggest that it is entirely Durkheim's fault. Well, more seriously, I mean, so in scholarship, we generally learn about thinkers from the debates that they get into, right? So we read Tylor and Durkheim at the same time. If you work on early Christianity, a lot of what we know about early Christian heresy are from Orthodox people who write about them and not from them themselves, right? And a similar thing has kind of happened, I think, and has always happened in academic work. So because we learn about and teach about figures via these debates, I think what you get necessarily are these almost these sort of polarized caricatures, which by necessity lack richness, depth, and nuance. So I don't know if there's something in particular about our history per se. I think it has something to do with our pedagogical tools, right, and our tools of the transmission of ideas. Is that for whatever reason, this is how we transmit ideas, by pitting people against each other.
Well, within anthropology so when I was an undergrad, I never heard of any of these folks, just very slightly. I mean, going into graduate school at phase one at the MA level, one of my people who turned into one of my professors, not my advisor on my supervisory committee, but when I told him I was interested in religion, the first thing came out of his mouth was, "You must really love Durkheim." And I was like, Durkheim? Who's Durkheim? But then it's curious as to why Durkheim. But it's like he becomes like the champion of actually studying religion, where apparently Tylor's dealing with other things. So
that's kind of understandable in the 20th century, I think, because if you have a book that's called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, and then you have a book called Primitive Culture, like there's a kind of political zeitgeist, which means that you might want to recommend one book and not the other for purely optics reasons, right? I guess it's Durkheim's fault.
But there was also the thing about the armchair allegation that in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, that whole Oxford style is just put aside, demonized in that sense. So then I don't know, maybe it becomes impossible to find that other Tylor again. After all, stockings, notes, they're just, there's a few bits of a diary or whatever it was. Somebody else has to represent it.
But Durkheim didn't go to Australia.
Exactly.
Right.
No.
Yes. He focused on one case study and drew all of conclusions about all human religion from it.
Right.
Brilliantly, yes. I think we should probably get into a Durkheim bashing.
But does sociology have to do that? I mean, can't sociology stay in the study and? No.
But anthropology
has reinvented itself.
What I was trying to do in my paper was to underscore that Tylor, like many others, had certain criteria for determining the validity of a statement, you might say. So in the issue of the question of whether humans were originally monotheistic, or whether they were at lower levels and developed higher on a social evolutionary scale. What I tried to argue was that Tylor had already decided the answer to this, not on the basis of his empirical investigations, although he cited empirical investigations, as so did Lang. Both did. And so did Wilhelm Schmidt. Wilhelm Schmidt was fantastic in his ethnographies, but he started from a position, and it all proved his position. So one way that I tried to look at these influential scholars is to try to help students see these fundamental starting points, and show how, therefore, the starting point produces the conclusion, and then examine how would it be possible to insert actual empirical evidence into this in order to determine the value of their arguments. That's one thing. But then the other point I tried to make in the paper was that all of these things, all of these discussions, at least in the study of indigenous peoples, is about people who are just there as sort of laboratory agents, and not really agents themselves, but they're there to be studied to prove the theory with which I began. And what I've tried to do is to say, if we look at some of the ways in which indigenous people have been depicted as passive, as powerless, as incapable of thinking, basically, or dreaming, or whatever, and they just do things because they're caught in this horrible existence and they have to solve their problems, but actually to let them have the voice, or a prominent voice, in how these questions are addressed and answered. And to my mind, if you go back to Tylor or any of these classical theorists, one can begin looking at ways which will impact on the way we do our own studies. And that, to me, is an important way of using these scholars.
A point that another contributor to the book likes to, Martin Stringer, likes to point out is the fact that it's very easy to classify Tylor in certain respects because because he was writing at what was still quite an early stage in the generation of the social sciences, that he, in some ways, lacked the kind of language to actually discuss some of the things he was wanting to get at. So one of the things that can get quite actually reading the text and then comparing that with the way Tylor is often interpreted is he's interpreted as someone who's just talking about individuals who are just kind of reflecting, and that, you know, the term savage philosopher kind of makes you think of an individual. If I actually recall the text accurately, I think he actually only uses this expression once or twice. I don't think he actually uses it very often. Right, yeah. It's quite an overplayed term, like, because it's become the term to explain Tylor, but he actually only refers to it once or twice. I think something that really gets missing, Martin likes to talk about the fact that some of what Tylor was fascinated with language and with different groups. Always remember that these were ethnological examples. So sometimes these things were far more social than they sometimes appear. And to relate that to the kind of work that is going on in the cognitive sciences of religion now, it's about very, very kind of you seem to be talking about like cognitive capacities. This is where, you know, the psychic unity of mankind comes in. You know, what are sort of patterns of thought that are widely shared. But behind this is very much a social context. So there's a brilliant quote where he talks about the fact that when people encounter dreams and visions, these are always in a very, very specific local form. If you're a Catholic, you're encountering dreams of the Virgin Mary, who will be, and this is produced by a social context. So, for example, a first century Catholic, or in as much as you can talk about Catholicism at that time, is not encountering the kind of a 16th century Catholic vision of the Madonna with all of the tiaras and the stylized depiction of the Madonna has already become an important part, and that's inherently social. What he's talking about. If I may just expand on one point, in terms of his, he actually, like at one point, tried to explain the evolution of the concept of ideas. We take, that's a word we take for granted, idea, but actually trace that to, I think it was Democritus. It was certainly one of the Greek philosophers. I think one of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, and actually tried to explain this as a product of a sort of animistic culture where ideas were or what would be termed ideas were actually encountered as almost personalities, and tried to really locate this in the context of Greece itself.
One thing that appears, at least, when we talk about Tylor's projection theory out of the inner individual, you have dreams, you see somebody die, breath goes out of them. It seems to imply that there is a spirit or a soul, and there's a body and a soul, and so on. That seems to me, at least, that what appears lacking, at least in this part of it, is the social context, the ritual context, in which these dreams or visions or relationships with the dead or ancestors is all, in a sense, socially validated, socially constructed, and then becomes lived out in ritual contexts. So, for example, the work I've been doing on Australian Aboriginal religions in some 1930s, as this man I've been looking at, T.G.H. Strelo, has discovered, was that the ancestors who then went back into the ground after creating and then come forth again in the rituals are actually reincarnated in their ancestors, but these reincarnation in the ritual now become the original totemic ancestor. So, but none of this, it seems to me, would make sense it's very difficult to make sense of anyway, but to make sense of it in strictly individualistic ways of thinking, it has to be understood in the whole way the society is constructed, and the relationships that people have amongst one another within the society and with other groups out with that society. So it's not directly related to your question, but it is sort of looking at this idea. If you say that Tylor was using a projection theory, that is projecting out of the individual experience to create this, it seems to me, if insofar as he did that, he overlooked and was deficient in the context of the social construction out of which these experiences occur. I'm not saying the experiences don't occur, but I'm saying they can only be interpreted and in a sense, made useful and meaningful in the social context.
But I think that's what Tylor shows us about the history of anthropology. At the beginning, Tylor and others are collecting instances of beliefs or practices of X kind, of Y kind, and then plotting where they are in populations. And as people start to look at the kind of methodologies, the evolutionist methodologies, then you get that moment where ethnography starts to become, perhaps following Boas in the United States.
Right.
The idea that rather than collecting and arranging ethnographic data in that way, one should contextualize it rather than see it as individual units that have that kind of distribution, but understand them as holistically interdependent with one another. In other words, ethnography, fieldwork, going to a particular place, staying there for a sustained period of time in which one learns the language and understands how this data is actually all connected relationally. And that's partly what studying a figure does, isn't it? It allows you to have access to the history of a discipline in a slightly different light and see it unfold.
Sorry, I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think we've come to the end of our the time allotted for this conversation, and that may be actually a perfect point at which to stop this thought about the reasons why these classic figures remain important and what we might pick up from them. So thank you all for joining in the conversation.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to our audience as well for participating.